it's a compulsion. So in lots of ways, if I could choose, sometimes I think if I could choose not to make paintings and not to make art, I would choose not to, because it's kind of a burden in lots of ways. But at the same time, it's also maybe the best way to spend my time. It's the way that I am at my most complete when I'm in the studio making or making drawings or working in some way. So I just think I just have to do it. I don't think it's really a choice. So my name's Henry Ward, I'm a painter. I was born in London and I live and work in London. As a child, I always thought I would do something involving drawing. I drew from a very early age, I guess, like lots of children do, and I couldn't really imagine doing anything else. But for a lot of, certainly my childhood and through school, I didn't really see how that would be a living or a way of kind of existing in the world. I just knew it was something I wanted to do. So I've got kind of memories of my dad used to bring rolls of wallpaper, lining paper home, and my brother and I would kind of lie on our tummies in the big bedroom and just sort of spread the paper out on the floor and work from one end to the other. These kind of drawing, I guess, narrative drawings where we'd use it as a way of kind of talking to one another and drawing at the same time. And I can remember doing that from a tiny age. So I think sort of drawing and then painting and I guess making art was always something that I just did and I couldn't imagine not doing. I did art at school and I did a lot of art at home. And I guess, following on from what I was saying about sort of drawing a lot as a child, I kind of imagined I might want to do cartoons or comic books. That was the big thing when I was younger. And then I ended up going to art school because that was the thing that you did if you were interested in doing art. It was like, you're going to go to art school, not university. And at art school, I suddenly realised that there were people in the world who were making art. I'd kind of imagined all the artists were long gone. So that was kind of a revelation. But it's interesting, I think the art school system in the UK is not really very technical. Most of the tuition isn't very technical. It's much more conceptual. It's much more about sort of thinking about ideas and developing ideas and stuff. So I sort of stumbled into painting, ended up doing a painting degree. In retrospect, ended up doing a painting degree somewhere that was a really interesting place to be at the time. But I think I probably learnt as much about how to paint from my peers as I did from any kind of tutors or formal training. And then, I've been painting, sort of seriously painting for more than 3 decades now and post art school. And I think I've kind of picked things up. I've probably acquired a lot of bad habits, but they sort of work. I don't think I'm necessarily technically a very knowledgeable painter, but things seem to kind of work, and I've been doing them long enough to sort of know what to do with materials. So I guess it's just a learning through doing more than anything else. I think increasingly, particularly in the last sort of 10, 15 years, my paintings have become more about the process of painting, and I think I'm most excited by what you do with paint. And I'm not necessarily interested in making paintings. I'm interested in painting. So for me, it's the process of making a painting that gives me the most that engages me the most, rather than actually having something that's finished. And actually, in some ways, I think to finish something is to finish it. It's like I've lost interest. It's when I've got, there's nothing else more for me to sort of interrogate, that maybe the painting is over. And then for me, it sort of is over. And it's very rare that I'll have something I've kind of finished that I'm interested in really spending much time with. So I think there's not really a message. It's very much painting to paint. I mean, there's a really interesting book called How to Paint by I think he's a Polish writer called Jerry Zinek, and in that he talks about the idea that it is only how we paint things that makes things interesting. It's not what they are. And the example he uses is Cézanne, and he says, Cézanne was painting pictures of apples and pears and oranges 140 years ago, and people still want to look at them, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with the fact that they're apples and pears and oranges. And I think that's absolutely true. So for me, it's completely about what I'm doing with the paint, what paint can do, and kind of finding things through the act of painting that makes it really interesting. I guess in a weird kind of way, I don't think I'm necessarily ambitious in terms of career. It's not like I don't think I'm sort of harbouring any major ambition to be hugely successful or hugely famous as a painter, but I recognise that there is something about being out in the world that's also an important part of the process. So I do want to show the work, and I do want people to see the work, and I do want people to talk about the work, and I think that feeds into the work, and that's an important part of it. I think in terms of the painting itself, it's a bit like I sort of said at the beginning about, in a way, it's a kind of a burdensome activity. I see it as being a bit, there's something slightly pointless to it, but I have to keep doing it. And I maybe sometimes have a slightly romantic idea that there might be a kind of a goal, some sort of holy grail of something I'm kind of crawling towards. But most of the time I know that that's just nonsense. And this idea that I'll make something, or something will happen in a painting, and I'll think, oh, I've really nailed that, or it's doing something really exciting. And then often the next time I come in the studio and look at it, I realise it's not doing that at all, and it's another sort of false dawn. But in a way, that's the thing that keeps you going, is you're sort of always looking for the answer to something, even though you kind of know at the same time that maybe there isn't really an answer. So it's this kind of weird suspension of disbelief. I think about it a lot, a bit like when sort of Wile E. Coyote is chasing Roadrunner, and they go over a cliff and they keep running, and they haven't realised that there's no ground, and they keep running, and it's fine, and it's only when they look down and realise there's no ground that they fall. And I kind of think that's not a bad metaphor for painting. As long as I keep doing it, and I keep making it, and I keep striving forward, I'm going to be okay. But if I start worrying too much about where I've got to, I might look down and realise that I left the floor behind. I wish when I started painting, I wish somebody had said to me, none of it's going to matter, it doesn't matter, just do it. I wish I'd not worried about doing it right or getting it right. I think if I could go back in time and give my sort of 20-year-old self some advice, I'd just say, just paint what you want to paint and take it on board and see where it goes. And I think, I was at art school at a time when things were really polarized. So what I mean by that is that, I went to an art school where there was a painting department, a sculpture department, and a printmaking department. And if you were in the painting department, you didn't talk to the people in the sculpture department, because they were downstairs banging bits of metal together. They drank more pints than we did. They were more like manual labourers. We didn't talk to them. Nobody spoke to the printmakers. Nobody took them seriously. And then even within painting, if you were painting abstract paintings, then you didn't believe in the figurative painters. And if you were painting figurative paintings, then you didn't believe in the abstract painters, and people would almost come to blows over the idea that you were painting in a different way. And that's kind of gone. And when I go and do bits of teaching in art school now, everybody's really nice to one another, and that's kind of lovely. But at the same time, I sort of miss that polarization in a way. But I think for me, looking back, I wish somebody had just told me, you just stick to what you're interested in. If you're interested in it enough, something will come out of it. Don't try and do something because somebody else says it's good. Do the thing that you believe in. I think that's probably the best advice. Yeah, there's been a few times. So the first really significant one was just after I left art school. And I think I left art school and at that, we're talking sort of early 90s, there was a big explosion in British art at the time. There was a kind of sense of people were coming out of art school and being picked up very quickly and being very successful very quickly. So I think a lot of us came out of art school believing that was going to happen to us, and it didn't. It didn't happen. It happened to very few of us. And I think I felt a bit disillusioned, and I felt disillusioned with the whole thing. And I sort of made the conscious decision that I was going to stop painting. And I was really into writing, so I was doing some writing. And I kind of went around for a few months telling everybody I was never going to make art anymore. I was just going to write, and it felt really liberating. And then after about 9 months, I realised I really wanted to make some paintings, but I'd spent so long telling everybody I knew that I wasn't going to paint that it felt like I couldn't. So I had to paint in secret for a while, because my persona had been built around the idea of somebody who wasn't going to make art. So that was probably the only time I really consciously stepped away from it. But there've been periods of time when, to do with usually other pressures in life, working, I taught full time for a long time, that took up a lot of energy, having a family, so all the other things that kind of, I guess, get in the way of painting. There've been times when it's really slowed up, and I've tended then to focus more on keeping sketchbooks, keeping drawing going. So I've had periods of time where I maybe haven't painted properly for a year or year and a half, but I've always kind of drawn and kept my hand in that way. But yeah, probably the only time I've sort of consciously stepped away was that first year after art school, and I was kind of drawn back about 9 months later. Because I'm very invested in education, and I still teach, and I run a charity that works on art education projects. And I think there's a real, I really believe there's a kind of symbiotic relationship between teaching and making, and I think that you learn as much from teaching as you do from being taught. So I think about teaching a lot, and I do think about and reflect on my experience of being taught. But I think what's interesting is I think it's actually not anybody who was teaching me painting. I think probably the most profound educational experience I can remember as a student was doing studying film as a sixth form student at school, and having these two tutors who just talked to us about a piece of film, but critically. And I think up until that point, I must have been about 16, 17, up until that point I'd never really imagined that you could look at something visual and you could think about it critically in the way that you might read a book and think about it critically. So it was a bit of a sort of revelation and a kind of epiphanal moment of watching a bit of film and then unpicking it and trying to understand what the director was doing visually, and realizing this was amazing, this was like magic. So then taking that kind of idea and taking it to paintings or to photographs or to drawings and thinking, what if you could do that to that as well? So it was a bit like suddenly everything became more than just the thing. It was this critical space as well. So I think that was probably the most profound thing. But I think in terms of sort of people painting, I think it probably was, I don't know, I had a great tutor at art school who was the head of painting, and I remember it wasn't so much about painting, but it was more about conviction. I remember she said to me once that there were like 30 people in my year as painters, and she said, you realise that a year after leaving art school, half of you will have stopped painting, and after 5 years there will only be maybe 5 of you that are still painting, and after 10 years there'll only be 1 or 2. And I remember thinking that was a really depressing statistic, but actually it was like it planted a seed of, I'm definitely going to make sure I'm in the 1 or 2 that are still painting. And now, you know, it's 32 years, over 32 years since I left my undergrad, and I can think of at least half a dozen people I was on that course with who are still painting. So she was wrong, but that conviction thing was really important. My parents both trained as teachers, and my mum was a school teacher, and so I spent a lot of my time being certain that I was not going to teach, and I sort of fell into teaching accidentally, really. So I was doing other things. I'd left art school, I was painting, I was doing kind of jobs that weren't great jobs, but just to kind of keep the practice going. And then a friend who was actually teaching in a primary school asked me if I would come and do like a workshop with her. They were year one, so they were sort of 6-year-olds. And I went in, I was terrified actually. I went in, talked about my work, did this workshop, but it was amazing. And kind of working with these kids and talking about painting and talking about drawing and then seeing them get excited and doing it felt really interesting. And in comparison to the other things I was doing alongside painting, it was the closest to being in the studio, to being kind of to making stuff. It felt really exciting. So I suppose I accidentally fell into teaching. And then once I started teaching properly, I realized that I really enjoyed teaching. I really enjoyed the way it opened up my thinking about practice. So I started out teaching as a secondary school art teacher, so I taught 11 to 18-year-olds. I did that for quite a long time. I got involved as a result of that in teaching teachers to teach art, which I really enjoyed. So I really enjoyed working with adults and thinking about how one might approach the curriculum. And then I left formal teaching and I got bits and pieces of visiting lecturer work. So I started teaching in art schools a bit more, which I also really enjoyed. And then more recently I've done some of that, but alongside that I teach on an alternative art school program. So I teach a little bit on going to visit people's studios and talk to them, but also this amazing correspondence course. So that it's an art school called Terps, and we teach by writing letters to other artists and they write letters back, which is a really lovely way of doing it. So it really slows the conversation down. So I think now I can't imagine making work in the studio without some element of teaching alongside it, and I certainly couldn't imagine teaching without making alongside it as well. So I think the two things kind of really need to coexist for me. Imagine if you were on an expedition 100 years ago and you need something and you write the letter, and it might take months for the letter to get there, and then it might take months for it to come back, and then when it does come back you have to really digest it because you can't respond straight away. And that idea of slowing it right down, and it is really lovely. So I find with my mentees each year is very often I'll open their first correspondence and I'll think, oh God, how on earth am I going to write about this? And if I was going into somebody's studio and seeing it, I'd have to on the hoof say, oh, you might want to look at this artist, you might want to do this, and there's value to that. But being forced to slow down and spend a couple of weeks looking at their work and really thinking about it, by the time I'm writing back, actually I've found loads of stuff I want to talk about because I've really had to slow my own looking down, and I think that's, yeah, it's really valuable. It's kind of interesting because I, for almost the whole time that I've painted, I've worked with oil paint and was quite sniffy about acrylics. And then 3 years ago, nearly 3 years ago, I was the artist in residence. I did an artist residency at the Albers Foundation in Connecticut. And I was over there for the best part of 3 months. And I was living and working in a cabin in the woods in Connecticut, the studio and the live work all in one building. And knowing I was only going to be there for 10 weeks and that it probably wasn't going to be practical to work in oil paint, I just thought I would use acrylics while I was there. And so I really immersed myself in acrylics for the first time. And actually I've not painted in oil since. So I've completely lent into acrylics, and I use them, I like to use them like I used oil paint. So I tend to slow them down with various mediums. I really like layering. So I work very fast. In that I make paintings very quickly, or I kind of cover surfaces very quickly. But the paintings are quite slow in terms of their gestation. So I'll have a lot of things on the go at any one time. And there's a kind of iterative layered quality to the painting. So I'll make something, I'll put it to one side, it'll go in the rack or it'll go in a drawer, it'll come out a bit later, it'll get reworked, it'll go back in the rack, it'll come out a bit later. So paintings are quick, but they might take years sometimes to finish. And what I love about working with acrylics and the kind of glazing layer of acrylics with medium is that you can get this sort of translucent layers, opaque layers, you can get this kind of response between different colors and different kind of handling of paint. And because acrylic does dry a bit quicker, sometimes I can speed that process up. So yeah, for the last sort of 2.5, 3 years, I've worked exclusively with acrylics. I try and buy kind of golden acrylics or Wallace Seymour acrylics, some of the kind of better quality. Not everything is that, it depends on some of the colors, but yeah, that's what I'm doing. And most of the time I work on canvas, but I work on wooden panels as well, and increasingly in the last sort of 6 months or so I've been doing a lot more work on paper. And then alongside working in the studio, I have a shed in my garden and I work on works on paper in the shed, and that's partly about maintaining as close as I can possibly get to sort of daily practice. So I can't get to the studio every day, but I can pop into the shed and work very quickly in the mornings or in the evenings or around other things I'm doing. And so the shed is about small works on paper, usually in acrylic as well. So there's a kind of a relationship between the two spaces going on too. I think it's probably, maybe it's a hang up from those art school days. I think there's something about doing it every day that makes it feel serious and makes it feel important, makes it feel real. I kind of think about it a little bit in relationship to maybe exercise. You know, if you run, you need to kind of run regularly. You're not going to run a marathon every day, but you need to go out and kind of keep your muscles warm. And I think there's something like that with painting as well. So I don't quite manage it every day, but there are times when I do a little bit every day. And just that sort of keeping my arm in and keeping exploring ideas and pushing things on, I just think for me that's really important. And you know, I have a busy life, so I squeeze things around lots of other things. So sometimes that's about snatching half an hour in the day just to kind of do something. And then those things sort of build, and then I'll go and do a residency and have a much more intensive period. And it's interesting how the rhythm of the work will change then when I've got maybe, you know, a month somewhere or 2 or 3 months somewhere, or even a couple of weeks somewhere where I'm just painting. The rhythm sort of shifts. But I think there is something about, yeah, maintaining a kind of daily engagement in the practice that I think is really important. So these ones are on a really heavyweight, like Fabriano sort of rag paper. So they're about 380 GSM. So they really take the paint really well. And I usually work on a heavyweight paper, but I have done some works. So something like this one in the frame there is on a much thinner paper, and I was kind of experimenting with allowing the paper to really wrinkle and buckle. I quite liked the way that created a sense of it being more object-like. So I play around with different papers, but generally they're quite heavyweight, and when I'm painting on them, I don't prep the paper beforehand, so the paint goes straight onto the paper, and I quite like the way it responds and reacts to it in that way. lots and lots of works on paper. So these would be, this is the size that I tend to work in the shed. So these are the kind of, there'll just be piles and piles and piles of these. And they kind of pile up. You know, the shed is not really set up, so there's not much space, there's nowhere to sit down, there's nowhere to kind of sit and have a cup of tea or listen to music. So you go in, you paint, you make a pile of stuff, there's a big pile of paintings, they come out, they get painted on again, they get put back, and then they come here and they sit in drawers, and sometimes they come out and yeah, it's become a really important part of the practice, and it was really important, particularly during the pandemic, because the studio's closed and the only place to make was the shed. So then it really became this kind of religious daily practice of out there, make paintings. They became almost like a diary. I tend to use, so I use, a lot of those kind of flat brushes, different sort of textures, but also these, I really like these much more traditional kind of big, fat, round brushes. And I think there's something about really loading a brush up and allowing the paint to really do its thing that I love. I mean, it's just a kind of seductive thing. I tend to use quite big brushes. I mean, probably there are some small ones here, but maybe the smallest might be around an inch, perhaps, something like that. Even on smaller works, tend to use quite big brushes. And then this palette thing is something that I've been doing for a really long time, just using containers and mixing a palette of colours and having a palette of colours that I'm using and keeping each of those colours really clean. So then there's not like a big palette where I'm mixing things together. So each colour ends up having its own kind of tray for a while. So I guess there's almost something quite childlike about that. It's like having a set of colours you're going to use, except I'm mixing those colours and choosing what I'm going to use beforehand. So, I mean, there's people, you know, there's things like, there's great photos of de Kooning in his Long Island studio, and you know, he's got sort of teacups and bowls, and there's all the paint mixed in different things. And I think maybe I looked at a photo like that very early on and thought, you know, I can remember at art school having a big glass palette and things, and it would get muddy and messy, and then just this thing of the takeaway containers being like, oh, that's a really good way of just keeping your colours clean, and it's stuck with me. So yeah, I've been using that sort of thing for 30 odd years. And then what happens, you know, like here, I'll use a colour on top of a dry colour, but then you're starting to get actually rather interesting conversations. So peripherally, something like that kind of this sort of maroony brown, and then that turquoise, and that kind of slightly muddy yellow, and then the creamy white, that might end up in a painting because it's sat in the palette, and then it's like, that's doing something interesting. And I think there's one of the things I'm really interested in this more iterative way of working, so working very quickly, but things not being finished quickly and being around for a long time, is that I know I go through phases of using certain colours and I'm just reaching for certain colours, but over time that will change. So if a painting sits around for long enough, it ends up being there's a liminal quality to it. It ends up being a conversation with itself over time, because there'll be a bit of a palette from 6 months ago will meet a palette now, and then a conversation happens that wouldn't happen right now if it was all painted. So it's interesting, things like this one. I just did a very short residency at a chapel down in Cornwall, and I was only there for a week, and I started a whole series of paintings. This is very early stages, and it was only after I'd been there a few days working that I realised that the colours of the palette, the colours of the chapel were becoming the palette of my paintings, and they were completely different to the colours that I'd been using when I was in London. And I was kind of slightly thrown back because it just hadn't been something I'd consciously done. But this sort of golden, ochre, browny colour, the more of the woody brown, the kind of cream, was the colours of the inside of this chapel space I was in, and they were just leaking into the painting. So I think there's something quite interesting about how the space you're in can shift and alter the way that you're thinking about what you're doing. So I do go through periods of making little objects, not like this. Normally they're tiny little things made out of stuff I've just picked up off the floor, and that came out of looking for a subject about 6 or 7 years ago. I just started making these little objects on my kitchen table. That was literally, I don't know, a couple of months ago. Coming in, there was a load of cardboard, some materials had come in. I started unpacking the cardboard, and then I thought, I'm just going to make that into a sort of form that's a bit like the forms in the painting. I don't really know why I did that, but it's there, and maybe it'll come into something at some point. And I quite like something about using like the cardboard and stuff, you know, like poor materials sometimes I think are really interesting. I guess it's a bit like using paper, and painting quickly on paper is often really liberating, and there's something about taking bits of cardboard and tape and making things with that and seeing what happens that's really interesting. There's something, it's, you know, no matter how long you've been painting, I don't know if you guys find this, but there's still a slight fear to the expensively stretched canvas surface. It's all ready, it's all perfect. And I like the fact that you can take a sheet of paper and just start, and it doesn't, you know, or paint back into something that's been around for a while is always really interesting. And we're going back to that thing about when things are finished, or that idea of the iterative quality. There's nothing better than having a painting that's been in the rack for maybe 6 months or a year, and you sort of think it's finished, and then you pull it out and you were a bit precious about it when it went in, and the preciousness is gone, and it goes up on the wall, and you just paint over most of it, and it's a great feeling. Destroying paintings is maybe as good as making them, I think. For logging them 25 years ago, so there's about 100 or so books there. But what's really weird with the sketchbook thing, so I keep sketchbooks, I've kept them really, so I've always got a sketchbook or two in my bag, and I go through periods of racing through them at, you know, one a month, and sometimes they take a bit longer. And then I love getting to the end of a sketchbook and labeling it and putting it on the shelf. And what I'm really terrible at is going back through them and looking at them, which is ridiculous because they are this repository of ideas. And on the occasions when I do pull them off the shelf, sometimes I find a sketchbook from 20 years ago, I'll flip through and go, God, that could be now. You know, I'm still interested in the same thing. So I'm constantly berating myself and saying I must get better at pulling my own sketchbooks off the shelves and looking at them. But I'm not very good at doing that. So that's 2024, and that's the second book of 2024. So that's all it is. See what's in here. Okay. So yeah, you can see they're often kind of quick sketches. There's quite a lot of writing. I do quite a lot of writing. Quite often sit in the studio at the end of a session, and I'll just write some things. And also more and more I'll draw from the painting. So I might sit in front of whatever's on the wall at the end of the day and make a drawing of it. And partly that's about, I guess, what we were talking about, this idea of slow looking. There's something about sitting in front of something you've made and then drawing it that forces you to look at it in a different way. So there's sometimes a relationship between, I might make a sketch, I then might use some of that sketch in a painting, then sometime later I might redraw that painting, then that leads to something else. It's this kind of, I guess there's like a constant back and forth relationship between them, and these tend to, I don't really show them very often. Very, very occasionally I'll take something out of a sketchbook and include it, but generally these are, yeah, like I say, they're made and then they get finished and then they get stuck on the shelves and then they just get covered in dust. It's slightly mad. Sometimes a little bit of acrylic paint. Generally they are, generally I work with like pen or sometimes pencil, occasionally charcoal, sometimes, I mean, this is using kind of post-it notes, so bits of collage. I think this is a bit more recent. When's this from? Yeah, earlier this year, discovered these really cool kind of paint marker things that I used a bit of, that I really enjoyed, although they were bleeding a bit. But so yeah, they tends to be pen mostly. And one of the things I think that's really happened a lot in the last maybe couple of years of painting is this sort of sense of almost characters appearing. So if I look back at work that I made 30 years ago, I was very consciously referencing things like sort of cartoon language, sort of Disney backdrops, bits and pieces out of films, and they were sort of being collaged together in the paintings. I don't do that now, but I think I'm very aware of, you know, the sort of things that I'm painting as becoming a bit characterful. It's like they've got limbs or legs or torsos, they're slightly like animated. And I'm looking more and more at sort of 1960s, 1970s children's book illustrations or kind of early cartoons, and thinking about the sort of impossibility of those things that look a little bit like they might have a name, but not necessarily something you can name, but you sort of feel a bit familiar. So, you know, things like this one here, you know, sort of, I'm very aware of this feeling a bit like some mad kind of fringe, and these are sort of like limbs. Maybe that's got some odd kind of shoe, and maybe this is like a head, but it's also a bit like some weird inverted pineapple. So there's these kind of odd, and I don't go into the painting or drawing, whatever it is I'm doing, I don't go in sort of thinking I'm going to draw a character, but I'm very conscious of these things sort of becoming a bit character-like. It's like they kind of come through the process of the painting itself. They always start with a I guess an idea of drawing. So I will draw with the paint, and normally I wouldn't say I have a plan. I have a kind of vague idea of how I'm going to start a form. So it might be, oh, I want something big that's going to fill the space, or I want the sense of two sort of forms that are nestling next to one, or I want something suspended. So I'll normally mix up a colour and I'll draw that form in fairly fast, and then I'll almost always eradicate most of that. So very quickly they go, right, I'm going to now like knock that back or wipe that out or shift that. And then in doing that, stuff starts to happen. So, you know, in something like this one, this kind of initial form was quite early on, but then you can see where this has kind of been painted over, and then this was painted on and then scraped back, and then you know, what I get excited about is when these little sort of juxtapositions happen that I didn't consciously paint, but I sort of got into a state with the painting where those things start to happen, and I must have consciously decided to leave them, and then I come back in, and you know, even the way that this kind of bloody reddy brown kind of colour is sort of sitting on top of this teal, and this rather lovely sharp edge that's translucent. You know, I'm really excited by the graphicness of that, and the way that that's sort of doing something interesting spatially. So I think for me, I think they are abstract paintings, but they are definitely entities, things, bodies on a ground or sitting within a space. There's definitely a foreground and a background. There's definitely a sense of things having a spatialness. It's not just about paint on surface. There is a sort of, I guess, a manifestation of a thing. I think the thing is quite an important thing for me, and I think they're funny, and I'm quite happy with that. I quite like the idea of making paintings which make people smile, maybe a little bit. That they're kind of a little bit odd and a little bit silly, and sometimes, you know, so something like this one up here, this little painting. I painted a whole series of paintings that looked a little bit like these sorts of characters, and there's another one here. I'll show you that they're kind of like they feel like they're slightly like slightly friendly little characters that maybe turning their backs on us, maybe they're sort of shuffling off, a bit bear-like, a bit creature-like, these funny little feet. So I'm kind of, yeah, I'm kind of interested in that idea of them having personality. I read about a painter who actually named their paintings like you might name children, and I really wish I'd thought of that idea. So they have a painting called Gary or a painting called Sandra, and I think that's really cool. That's like a really great idea, but it was somebody else's idea. So my paintings don't have names like that, but I sort of wish they did. Not always, but often the titles of my paintings are, I like words that could be both a noun and a verb. So I think there's something interesting when you think it might be one thing and then you think of something else. I mean, the titling is so problematic for abstract art, because part of the appeal of working abstractly is that you put something in the world that maybe you yourself don't completely recognise and know. And as soon as you give it a title, you slightly narrow people's sort of interpretation. But at the same time, I think titles can be really exciting in the way they open things up. So I quite like using titles that you think is one thing and then you think, oh, hang on, is it something else? But then the other thing, when I've done residencies, because the work always does end up feeling a bit more about the place, then those works tend to be titled sort of after the place that I was in, almost like a record of being there. Let's pull a few bigger things out. So something like this is a really good example of a painting that went through loads of phases and I thought was finished, and then about 8 months later it came out and it wasn't. And these forms, these two sort of, I guess they're slightly leg-like forms, actually were started out the other way around, and they came from these kind of fluted pillars in the building. But then when I turned it around, I realised they were kind of like legs, and this is like a big arse or a bag, a strange bag sitting on the legs, I think. Let's find. Yeah, this is another one in progress from the residency in Cornwall. So very much this idea of these kind of legs, and this sort of weird fringe thing, but this kind of like a shoe. I don't know if you have the Mr. Men books in the States, but they were sort of something I grew up with, and they're like Mr. Strong, Mr. Fussy, Mr. Bump, and they all had like these odd characters, and I realised that does look a bit like Mr. Noisy's shoes, so I'm kind of conscious this feels almost like two characters dividing and splitting, some slightly strange headgear going on. Someone kind of, I guess this is a good example, thinking about just the sketchbook stuff I was just showing you, of where there was a direct translation in this one from a sketchbook into the painting. So this kind of crisp, masked pink shape on the left came straight out of a post-it note drawing in the sketchbook, but then it went through several other stages. It's got this slightly odd kind of clockwork thing happening. Another one from around about the same time that's like a, this one's called Jester. Kind of feel like it's like a trophy doing that with its arms. Yeah, quite challenging, but so this is not very technically interesting, but so I'm just going to use like it's almost like thin white paint with a medium to just create a kind of translucent, it's like a way of sort of erasing parts of what I'm doing. So this is this thing of finding forms and starting to sort of, I realised that this has a kind of feeling of almost these things. I was looking at it earlier and it almost feels like two hands. I quite like the way of paws, but I think that what's going on here is maybe a bit distracting, so I'm going to lose some of this bottom part.